Thanks for coming out tonight. I want to welcome you to tonight's lecture, which is sponsored by the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions. The Washington Forum is a civic education initiative which aims not just to promote intellectual diversity here at Ohio University, but also provide a forum where contentious and sometimes difficult subjects can be discussed and debated in a reasoned and in a reasonable way. Tonight's lecture, like all Washington Forum events, is not made possible by public funds, but by the generous donations of Ohio University alumni and staff, and by grants from foundations, including, in this instance, the Charles Koch Foundation. Tonight's speaker is Kimberley Strassel. She is a member of the Wall Street Journal's Editorial Board based in Washington, D.C. Since 2007, she's written the Potomac Watch column. She joined the editorial page in 1999 as an assistant editorial features writer for the journal, covering real estate for the news pages and spending 4 years in London writing about technology for the journal's European edition. She joined the editorial board in 2005, a graduate of Princeton University. Her most recent book is called The Intimidation Game. The subject of that book is free speech, and free speech is an important issue here at Ohio University. For all of its many virtues, and I've taught here for going into my 14th year now, and there are a lot of virtues to the university. Unambiguous support of free speech is not always, it strikes me, one of them. In 2007, the university designated 22 so-called free speech zones, and by implication, the rest of the campus was an unfree speech zone. And student groups who wanted to have a protest had to register to demonstrate in one of those 22 authorized spaces. Thanks to the work of the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, enough pressure was brought to bear that the university abolished that policy. Later, in 2015, the university settled a $32,000 lawsuit and significantly revised the Student Code of Conduct, which the university itself acknowledged had provisions that unduly impinged on students' First Amendment rights. And just this last spring, when some students posted supportive messages for Donald Trump and his policies, such as they are, on the university's graffiti wall, the university sent out a message to us all, acknowledging that this wall is a place of free speech and expression, but empathizing with those who had been offended by the wall's messages. Some students demanded that all students be mandated to take a cultural competency course as part of their freshman orientation, presumably teach them not to think or express culturally incompetent things. In the latest student senate meeting, there were proposals for additional lighting and cameras on the graffiti wall. People are allowed to express themselves in loving ways, the student senate president declared. Presumably unloving speech was unacceptable and thus prohibited. And the cameras would be there to help identify those unlovingly exercising their First Amendment rights to free expression. There is then, even at a public university, an evident uneasiness about what sorts of speech can be expressed and where they can be expressed. And that uneasiness, Kim Strassel argues in her work, exists not just at universities, but extends to national politics as well. Yet, she argues, whereas leaders of public universities have largely acknowledged and mostly protected First Amendment free speech rights, political actors have often been less eager to do so. How and why that's the case will be the subject of her talk tonight. After her talk, she'll be glad to take questions from the audience, and I hope it goes without saying, as I read official legerdemain, that Ohio University seeks to provide opportunities for learning and free exchange of ideas, including events such as this one. In keeping with this goal, an opportunity and question and answer with Ms. Strassel will follow this evening's formal presentation. In the interest of ensuring an orderly event, audience members are asked to refrain from engaging in conduct that will disrupt the event. Anyone engaging in disruptive behavior will be subject to removal. I'm asked to read that, but maybe I'll just put it in a way that strikes me as most apposite. We expect civil debate. We expect for questions to be questions. And as always, we expect answers to be answers from the speaker. And I hope you'll join with me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Kimberley Strassel from the Wall Street Journal.
Good evening. I want to thank Dr. Ingram and Ohio University for having me here. This is the first time I have ever been here. In fact, it was cute. I have 3 small children. They are age 11, 8, and 5. And I try to keep them informed about where mom is going. And so yesterday I said, you know, guys, sorry, I'm going to be gone tomorrow night. I'm going to be in Athens. And my 8-year-old daughter looked at me and said, good luck with that, because you don't even speak Greek. So I'm glad that all of you can understand the language I'm actually speaking in. And I am really thrilled to be here. I want to talk to you about free speech tonight, and some really disturbing things that I have found out there in the course of reporting this book that I did. But before I did, just a quick word on the First Amendment, because in today's day where we're having so many discussions on campuses and elsewhere about speech, I just don't think that this can be said enough, that it isn't any more basic than this. That the First Amendment is your basic guard of freedom and democracy. There is no more important amendment than the First Amendment. I mean, if you think about it, when the framers came up with their Bill of Rights, they had plenty of things that they wanted to guarantee for their citizens and make sure that they were good with in a democracy and a civil society. Protection against double jeopardy, protection against search and seizure, states' rights, the right to keep and bear arms. But of all of those, they chose that the very first one, the First Amendment, should be free speech. And the reason why is because founders understood that if you have free speech, you cannot have tyranny in a country. Okay? When you go out and you look around at any authoritarian government in the world, one of the first things they always do is limit the right of people to speak freely. Because if you can control that, if you can limit a person's ability to criticize the government, that is a way in which you maintain power. And our founders of this country had been subject to that themselves. And they understood that free speech and unfettered free speech, especially political free speech, which, by the way, is carved out within the First Amendment as the most protected of all speech, was the way that you maintain a democracy. So the First Amendment, absolutely sacred, matters more than almost anything. And I think it's an important thing just to be reminded of in a day where we talk about safe zones and how you can only talk about words in loving language. No, that was not what the founders said. The founders said, we want people to debate, criticize, say things that are uncomfortable and difficult, and then have an argument back on the other side. So that kind of leads me to the subject of tonight's talk, which is we are witnessing a very disturbing and worrisome shift when it comes to free speech protections in this country. And I would argue it's one of the more alarming shifts that we have seen in this country since at least the civil rights era, perhaps going all the way back to the founding of the country. And what's interesting about this political shift is that, unlike most, and by the way, I cover politics, I have for several decades, it's very unusual that you can never point to a day or a time when a political shift happens. They just tend to kind of creep up on you, and before you know it, that's the way the political environment is. This particular political shift is interesting because you can trace it to one day. And that day is January 21st, 2010. And that is the day that the United States Supreme Court issued its Citizens United ruling. Okay, and for anyone who's not familiar with that ruling, what it essentially did in a 5-4 ruling is it freed up the First Amendment. It allowed a lot of people who had been barred from the political process to come back into the political process. And the history here is really, really interesting. And to understand the history, just a quick word on money and politics. A lot of people out there have an absolute, just basic idea that money and politics must be bad. And I'm here to tell you that that is not actually the case. Money is a proxy for speech, okay? Money is what allows us to speak. There used to be a day and an age where you could go and stand on your town, village, street corner on a soapbox and give your lecture, and you could be pretty guaranteed that most people around you would hear your political message. But that is no longer possible in today's day and age. You can only speak to the nation if you have the money to do it, okay? So, and if you think about it, it's actually just a really reasonable prospect. Let's put it in a different context. Let's say that all abortions were legal everywhere, anytime, any space, anywhere you wanted them to. However, there was a rule that said you could not spend any money to have an abortion facility. That would obviously undercut your ability to provide those services, okay? Let's say that the right to keep and bear arms, any kind, was completely unfettered. There were no gun rules whatsoever. Anyone could buy and sell them, but you had a law that said no one in the country could spend any money on manufacturing facilities for firearms or retail outlets for firearms. I think we would all agree it'd be pretty hard to transfer firearms or make firearms in the country. So money enables us to do things, and money enables speech. Less money, less speech, more money, more speech. If any of you said you wanted to go run for the presidency and I said, that's fine, you can only have $50 to go do it, I think we could all agree you'd have a pretty hard time getting your message out to 320 million people in the country. The reason this matters is because a long time ago, the people who didn't like the First Amendment in this country, politicians, et cetera, that wished there was something they could do to crack down on speech and knew they couldn't because of the First Amendment, they hit on the money point. They figured out that if you could restrict money, you could restrict speech. And for 100 years in this country, we've seen a back and forth of political parties using campaign finance laws to try to push their political opponents out of the political arena. And both sides did it equally for a long time. You can go back and you look at Republicans, they used wartime excuses as a way to bar unions from spending money in elections and taking part in elections. They used wartime problems as well to pass laws barring civil servants from taking part in elections and giving money in elections because they knew that civil servants tended to support Democrats. Democrats on the other side did it as well. They passed campaign finance laws to push companies out of elections because companies tended to support Republicans. Nonprofits as well. And both sides layered these laws on higher and higher and higher until you get to 2010. The McCain-Feingold Act has been passed, a big campaign finance law, and it comes in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, you people have got to stop. You have gone too far. The amount of regulations that are now on there is outright stifling free speech and the ability for people to take part, and so we are getting rid of a bunch of this law, and all of you can come back into the political arena, okay? At that point, something very profound happened in our national politics, which is the subject of this book that I wrote about. The Supreme Court issues that decision. And something to keep in mind, I'm a First Amendment absolutist. When I went out, I had intended to sort of look at both sides of the political arena and write about all of their abuses in the free speech area. One thing I found as I was going about it is it really was happening on one side, okay? Republicans over the years had come to understand that campaign finance laws were a violation of the First Amendment. They felt that it was a problem. They had turned against them. The left, on the other hand, had become more and more enamored of them, wanted them there, probably in part for good intentions and the belief that they stopped corruption in government, but also because they also knew it was a way to keep their political opponents out. When the Citizens United decision came down, they freaked out publicly. I mean, this is all documented out there in the press. And you got to put this in political context as well, too. The political operatives, it wasn't just that all of their opponents, companies, nonprofits, the Tea Party were all going to suddenly be able to take part in elections and campaign against them. It was a political environment. Barack Obama had been elected in 2009, had passed some laws that had proven very unpopular with significant portions of the population. There was a tide rising, a backlash rising in the midterm elections of 2010. Democrats were very scared about the money that was about to come pouring in against them, the speech that was about to be directed against them in the 2010 elections. So they had a public discussion, and you can trace this out there in the literature. They said, what are we going to do? This is terrible. And they came to a conclusion. They had a public discussion, and they said, all right, if we can no longer outright use the law to bar our political opponents from taking part in elections, we're going to do the next best thing. We're going to humiliate them and shame them and intimidate them and embarrass them and generally send the message that if they continue to exercise their constitutional rights, they will pay a political and personal price. And this is what we have seen happen in the country for the last 6 years. And it's incredibly disturbing because you see it being used in a variety of different tactics. These are not random. These are not things that just happen here or there. There are people who coordinate them. They are working together. They replicate them. They hone them. And we're seeing them across the country. Different tactics. One of them has increasingly been calling on federal bureaucracies to go after your political opponents. Best example of this, the IRS targeting scandal, okay? A bunch of nonprofits, they go and ask for nonprofit status with the IRS. I went out and interviewed a number of these groups for the book. These are people like the group that I interviewed out in California. They were not partisan. They called themselves constitutional conservatives, but to be perfectly honest with you, they were just as disgusted with George W. Bush as they were with any Democrats that were out there. They set themselves up because they wanted to do things like hold signs on Memorial Day honoring veterans. They wanted to get their nonprofit status because they wanted to enter themselves in a grant competition to get money so they could hang up signs all around their neighborhood saying, vote. Okay, it didn't say vote for a certain person. It didn't say vote for the right, vote for the left. It had this very sort of, I saw the mock-ups for it, this very beautiful big poster that had flags and the Constitution. It said, do your duty and vote. So this was the sort of thing they set themselves up for. The IRS instead harassed these groups. And to this day, you know, the White House, Senate Democrats, they'll all say, well, what happened here? There were just some IRS agents in Cincinnati, line agents. They didn't really know what was going on. They didn't understand the law. It was just a boneheaded error. This was all a mistake. That is not true. We have the emails, we have the documents that show what happened. And what happened was this. Elected Senate Democrats wrote letters to the IRS demanding that the IRS interrogate and stop exactly these groups. The President of the United States went out on the stump every day in 2010 and said, look at these shadowy organizations, and named the names of these organizations and said, you know, we don't know if they're funded by foreign entities. They might be operating illegally in this country. Somebody ought to do something. Okay, it was a dog whistle to the IRS because the IRS had been teed up for this discussion. There have been letters sent in. Activist groups have been pressing the IRS to do something about these nonprofits. They didn't have the legal right to wage this harassment campaign, but Lois Lerner there took in these letters, they took in what the president was saying, their boss, the President of the United States, and went out, segregated these groups out, sent them harassing questionnaires, in some cases 80, 90, 100 questions. Who donates to you? Who did you talk to last? Who in Congress do you interact with? Send us a list of every web page you ever published. Sent these things out, and the idea here was a couple of things. First of all, put these people on a permanent state of ICE so that they could not get their nonprofit status, they could not raise money, and they could not participate in elections. And two, to make some of them give up so that they would not do this anymore. And in fact, they succeeded in that. One of the groups that I interviewed revoked their application to the IRS because it was too scary for them. When you get a piece of paper from the IRS that says, under penalty of perjury, answer the following 80 questions and sub-questions, and you know you got that piece of paper from the IRS in the first place, and you're under the belief that the IRS is after you, you're going to be very scared about answering those questions and sending them in. In the end, this was 400 groups representing tens of thousands of Americans who were pushed aside and were not able to exercise their voice during an election campaign. And not only that, the senior membership of the Treasury Department knew all of this was happening by early 2012. They'd sent someone out and investigated it because of the complaints that they were getting, and they kept it quiet and hid it from Congress. We have emails showing this so that they could continue to keep these groups quiet for the 2012 presidential election. Okay, that's just an abuse of free speech. It's abuse of constitutional rights. Government should not be doing these things. So that's one tactic you see, and you see it in different ways at the FEC, at the SEC, at the Federal Communications Commissions. It's being replicated in different places. Another way you see it, prosecutors who who are abusing their power to go after political opponents. One of the scariest stories I write about in this book happened up in Wisconsin, and some of you may have heard of this. There was an investigation ostensibly on campaign finance law. I can tell you it was bogus, and I'm not the only one to say this, and listen to the story and you'll understand why, but several liberal prosecutors ended up conducting an investigation of 30 different groups that supported Governor Scott Walker's government reforms. And of course, that was a very flashpoint issue up in Wisconsin. It had to do with public sector unions, protests, people fled the state so they didn't have to vote, national focus. Not long after it happened, the prosecutors commenced this investigation. They did it under a special law in Wisconsin called the John Doe Law, which allowed you to do the investigation in secret and to put anyone who was under investigation under a gag order. So anyone who was being investigated could not talk about the fact that they were being investigated. Think about that. It's like Orwellian. Anyway, they do this, they confiscate financial records, they confiscate emails, they go into people's houses. They staged pre-dawn raids in people's homes. They showed up in the early morning dark to certain targets. In one of the stories that happened up there, one of the targets of these raids, he and his wife were gone on a charitable fundraising trip. Their teenage son was home alone in the house when the policeman came to the door in the morning dark, came in, sequestered him in a room, would not let him call an attorney, would not let him call his grandparents who lived down the road, ransacked the house, took things out, and as they were leaving, informed him that if he told anyone what had happened to him this morning, he would go to jail because it was being done under a gag order. This went on. And finally, one brave soul broke the gag order, came to the Wall Street Journal and told us about what had happened there. We wrote the story about it. It all broke out into the national press. A lawsuit ended up getting filed. It went all the way up to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, which ultimately voted to shut this investigation down. And in its ruling, which I think this phrase that came out of the ruling tells you everything about the point of the intimidation game, the Wisconsin Supreme Court wrote, and I'm slightly paraphrasing here, that the prosecutors in this case had invented theories of law in order to go after citizens who were wholly innocent of wrongdoing. So that's the intimidation game, where you use your power, abuse your power, send the message to the people. In this particular case, this is what's going to happen to you if you run ads against things that we don't like. You're going to have your house raided. You're going to have your emails ransacked. And the people involved in this too, they had to spend exorbitant amount of money hiring attorneys to defend themselves against these suits. They had to spend the time, and many of them said to me in the end, they felt that one of the reasons that these had been brought was not just to harass them, but to so divert them to focus on this investigation that they didn't have time for any of their political work anymore, because they were so busy defending themselves against this prosecution. So that's another tactic we see. We see it right now in terms of prosecutors who are bringing or attempting to bring RICO charges against Exxon and think tanks that have worked with Exxon for the supposed crime of thinking the wrong way on climate science. I mean, think about this, that we're going to jail people for having the wrong thoughts, wrong scientific opinions on ideas. We also see it in activist groups that go after free market organizations with pressure campaigns, boycotts, blackmail letters. There's an organization known as the American Legislative Exchange Council. It promotes free market reforms at the state legislature level. It's supported by corporate donations. Many on the left do not like the fact that corporations give money to politics, even though it is a constitutional right to do so. A number of activist groups, about 25 or 30 of them, banded together, and they decided to look at ALEC's donors and go to each of them individually, every corporation, Kraft, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, different places, go to the individual board members at each of those corporations and threaten to run ad campaigns in their hometowns, calling them racists and climate deniers if their companies continued to give money to ALEC. This was such a successful campaign that ALEC lost about 100 of its corporate donors in a space of a couple months. It nearly closed down. for doing nothing more than exercising its right to engage in public policy. And these were threats, flat out threats, that were designed to intimidate and scare the corporations out of their donations for a free market organization. We see it against individuals, and this is the thing that scares me the most. A lot of people many of you out there in the audience may think, well, this is what happens in the rough and tumble of politics. Corporate organizations, Fortune 500, big rough and tumble political outfits, it's an ugly world out there, but it's happening to average people too. Out in California, there were a number of people several years ago who gave money in favor of the Prop 8 traditional marriage, a ballot initiative. Okay, and by the way, whatever your views are on gay marriage, I think we can all agree that anyone has a right to support a ballot initiative or disagree with the ballot initiative, okay? The people who gave money in favor of this ballot initiative, which was in favor of traditional marriage, activists in the state went through financial disclosure records and got each of their names and addresses. And then they put them on a searchable and walkable map so that you could go home to home and target your opponents. The people whose names were on that list had their cars keyed and their windows broken, and they had threatening messages left on their voicemails and their emails. Some of them who were small business owners had flash mob protesters show up outside their place of business and block customers from coming in. There were people who ended up losing their jobs over this, the most famous one being the CEO of Mozilla, Brendan Eich. But there were many other people who were not as famous who lost their jobs as well too. Enormous disruption in their life for the crime of expressing their political viewpoint. And I think that it's worthwhile being clear too, again, these are not random things, these are not accidents. This is now a strategy by many people, by many organizations. And one of their favorite weapons that they use is what you saw out there in California, disclosure laws. And it's something that we all need to rethink again. We have a really interesting history in this country about disclosure and political anonymity, which actually began in the Civil Rights era. In the Civil Rights era, there was a very famous Supreme Court case, one of the most famous court cases that we have with regards to the First Amendment, called NAACP versus Alabama. And in it, you had a Jim Crow attorney general down in Alabama who was very unhappy with the NAACP because the NAACP had just staged a Montgomery bus boycott and done various other things that were making things uncomfortable for the governors and the people governing Alabama. So this attorney general brought a kind of hokey lawsuit against the NAACP, but as part of that lawsuit, he demanded that the NAACP turn over a list of all of its members. Okay, and I can tell you he wasn't asking for it so he could send them thank you notes. This was at a time when people were getting shot. There were fire bombings. There were people losing their jobs for their political convictions. And the NAACP, to its credit, fought this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous 9-0 decision in the end, found that the NAACP did not have to turn over those lists. And in doing so, clarified the First Amendment and said, not only do people have the right to free speech, not only do they have the right to freedom of assembly, to associate with other Americans, but they have the right to do so anonymously at times, because to do so openly could put them at risk of targeting by the government or their enemies. They could lose their jobs, they could lose their livelihoods. It was a very important, groundbreaking decision. We had a lot of other decisions that backed it up. It kept going that way all the way until Watergate and some of the shenanigans there, which case we got our first big campaign finance laws that required disclosure. The court to this day has never reconciled those prior decisions in which they guaranteed Americans some measure of anonymity with its disclosure requirements in which people have to give all their political information out. But it is something that should increasingly worry everyone. We have this vast disclosure regime, but it's been turned on its head in this country. Disclosure is meant to be a tool by which citizens keep track of their government. But if you watched Hillary Clinton's server scandal, you will know that government has in fact become very good at hiding its information from people. Instead, disclosure is being used by government, by activists, to go out and keep track of citizens themselves and harass them, intimidate them, try to scare them out of taking part of elections. One of the most disturbing things I did in this book was there were depositions filed out in that California case of the people who had been targeted as a result of all of this. At the end of each one of those depositions, almost every person said the same thing. They said, based on what happened to me in this ballot initiative, I will not likely take part in another ballot initiative again. And of course, that is the harassers winning. That's what they wanted to do. So we need to rethink disclosure laws. Right now, for instance, if you give anything more than $199, everyone knows who you gave money to. And I think the scary thing for people ought to be not things that directly happen to you, but the things that you don't even know happen to you. I mean, we're here on a university. How many professors don't get tenure because somebody went and looked and saw who they gave to in a political election? How many kids wonder why their kids didn't make, how many parents wonder why their kids didn't make the varsity team because the coach went and looked and saw who they cared about in politics and took it out on them? How many people, their neighbors don't want to have lunch with them because they find out about? I know people who don't give money in politics, don't participate in politics for this reason. And I think the other thing we need to think about is, again, $200. I don't mean to sound cynical. I work in Washington, D.C. I can tell you there ain't no politician in Washington, D.C. who's going to get bought off for $200. So maybe that limit needs to be a little bit higher. Maybe we need to think whether or not we should have disclosure for ballot initiative contributions. Is there a real threat of corruption there in giving money to something you believe in? Should there be disclosure for money that we spend on issue ads? Those are ads in which you don't advocate that somebody win or lose, but you just say, here's something you need to know about healthcare. Here's something you need to know about free speech. Is there a threat of corruption in having that be anonymously done? What we should be caring about is transactional politics, in which are donations that we worry that we're buying off a politician or not, and keeping track of that. But disclosure is increasingly being used as a weapon simply to harass people. There are initiatives across the country at the moment trying to get more disclosure. You have attorney generals in New York and California who are demanding that nonprofits hand over what is otherwise protected donor information to them. They're not doing so because they care about cleaner elections. They're doing so because they want new targets of people to go and harass. And it's something that we should all be concerned about, because right now this is being used by one side against another, but there's no reason why it can't be used by that side against the first. No one should live in fear of harassment and intimidation for expressing their political views. So anyway, this is a little bit of a downer conversation. I didn't mean it to be quite that bad. But a little premise on some of the things that we see going on out there, the importance of free speech. I thank you all so much for coming to listen, and I'm very, very happy to take any questions on this or anything else. Thank you. I also cover politics, so we can talk about that too. No questions? Yes?
Where would you put the condition of transactional concern when a politician is being bought out? How would you see that actually work?
So even I have become very skeptical of disclosure, but even I still think that there's a very pressing reason why we track donations to individual candidates. Again, I don't think it needs to be at $200. And it might be different at different levels: local government, state government, federal government. As I said, I can't think of much reason why donations as little as $200 should be tracked anymore. But look, why do we have disclosure laws? Is because we worry that someone is paying off a politician to get something done. And so we do want to keep track to a certain degree of where that money is coming from and what the politician is spending on as well. I think we should also have full disclosure for political spending too. But the sort of threshold is the question, and then whether or not we need disclosure in other areas too. Yes, sir.
So this is the United Cases of 5-4 decision, and it's a very narrow one, and it seems to me that decision, sorry, it's decisive decide, is sort of hanging on a knife edge right now. And if Hillary Clinton is elected and her nominees for the court go through, it doesn't seem like that decision stands much of a chance. If it is overturned, what avenues are left, if any?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I agree with you. Hillary Clinton has. Oh yeah, let's summarize the question. So he said, given that Citizens United was decided on a 5-4 basis, it sort of hangs on a knife edge. It seems as though if Hillary Clinton were elected, it seems unlikely that it would survive. And then the end of your question was?
Is there a fallback for people who are concerned about free speech?
Is there a fallback for people who are concerned about free speech? I think we should be very worried about that, because she's already said first 30 days in office that she is, well, the first thing she's done is she has already invited someone to challenge Citizens United. She went out and gave a speech and said, please, somebody file a new test case that will allow us to overturn this. And, you know, there is this longstanding principle in judicial decisions, stare decisis, which you just mentioned, which is the notion that courts tend not to willy-nilly change their decisions, and they kind of keep the ones they have. But in this case, I have very little faith. You have Justice Ginsburg, who's already come out and said this is a terrible decision, we ought to overturn it, sort of inviting people to bring a new case. So, and you know that there are already groups out there that are working on that. For anyone who's not aware, a lot of Supreme Court cases that get all the way up to the highest level, they are not random cases that happen in the United States. People engineer them to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So there are probably groups at the moment that are working on that. More troublesome to me is that Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, when he was running, both promised that within 30 days of taking office that they would introduce a new amendment to essentially overturn the First Amendment. I mean, that's not how they say it. They say, we're going to introduce an amendment to overturn Citizens United. But if you look at the language of that amendment, what they are essentially saying is we want a new amendment that will once again put government in control of who can speak in elections. And if anyone thinks that's a good idea, I mean, James Madison was pretty good at what he did. And, you know, this is no negative comment just on Hillary Clinton, but she's not as good as he was. So, yeah? Yes, sir.
So your kind of characterization about the role of money and in free speech and stuff, I mean, don't the people who are pushing for campaign finance, don't they also push that forward sort of on the grounds of free speech? Could you articulate a little bit better or just a little more clearly their argument, the one that you're kind of going against?
So,
I mean,
yeah.
For example, if you, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert, so that their argument is something like somebody who has vastly more money, you're sort of characterizing the positive aspect. Yes, if you have money, but if there's a giant disparity in money, that inhibits free speech because the person who doesn't have the money is not going to be heard, you know?
Yeah.
So.
No, I mean, and so the question is can you characterize the campaign finance reformers' view of who would make the argument that campaign finance, in fact, helps free speech? And they will make many arguments for that, and I will do my best to say what they are. I'll also tell you why I don't think they're true. But, I mean, they will say, for instance, that there are people and their favorite go-to person are the Koch brothers, sort of billionaire Koch brothers or whomever it is, and say they have all the money and so they can buy elections. And then that inhibits average, normal, everyday voices from being heard. So that is one argument that you'll hear out there. You'll hear that it somehow sort of stifles the average person. Corruption, that you can't tell, you know, who's getting bought off here or there. They like to talk about dark money as well, too. And that is money that is not publicly disclosed. So a couple of things on that. First of all, money enables speech, but money does not enable good speech. So my argument would be that, you know, you can spend all the money you want to on a candidate who's saying something that the American public doesn't buy, and it really doesn't matter. You know, a good example of this, 2014 elections, there was a very prominent billionaire philanthropist named Tom Steyer on the left who really wanted Senate Democrats to keep the Senate. Spent $75 million in 7 different Senate Democratic races across the country. He lost every one except for one, and they lost the Senate. So $75 million, that's a lot of money in an election. It didn't help the candidates who were in a bad, tough situation that year. They were destined to lose for lots of complicated, broader reasons out there. I would also make the argument that, in fact, money allows the smallest people to have voices. The people who have the biggest voices in politics these days are incumbents. They get to stand up at a microphone like this every day and free of charge tell the whole nation what they think from the floor of the Senate and from news conferences and whatever. You want to change that, you want to throw them out, you want to get a new person in, whether you want to get Bernie Sanders in or whether or not you want to get some Republican conservative from some district in, the best way you do it is to have someone that has at least enough money to counter that speech. I think money is the best way for reform in the way too. One last thing, you hear a lot about dark money. I don't call it dark money. I think that that's one of those kind of slick political terms. I call it protected money. So every year at the federal election level, we spend about $7 billion putting together a federal government. And that may sound like a lot of money to people, but just to put that perspective, that is how much money every year we spend on Halloween. Okay, so I would like to think that the process of forming one of the greatest democracies on the planet and electing quality people to do so is at least as important as Supergirl costumes and milk duds. Of that $7 billion, about $320 million, which equals about 3 or 4%, is money that is not disclosed. The rest of it, 96%, close to 97%, is all disclosed. That 3 or 4% are largely individual donors, people who give money to C4 organizations or C3 organizations, who own small businesses, who are very worried that some of the things that I just described are going to get visited down upon them if it's found out that they gave money to these different organizations. It really is not something that in any way can be corrupting to our government because it just is hardly any money at all in terms of the money we spend in politics. So I think there's a lot of arguments, and I have no doubt, I don't want to be mean about this, I have no doubt that there are some people who truly believe that campaign finance laws are necessary, like broad-ranging campaign finance laws are necessary for sort of clean elections and that are motivated by that. But I can tell you from my time in Washington that most of these campaign finance laws are developed by the politicians and they're done by the politicians to protect themselves in office and to make it harder for anyone to challenge them. And that is one of the sad stories of campaign finance. And we've unfortunately allowed it to kind of carry on in a way. They claim they're doing it for us, and in the end, the only people's speeches that is getting robbed is ours. So, yes, sir.
Here, as on other campuses across the country, the central administration has been picking and choosing who has the right to free speech, privileging some students' speech over other students' speech. I'm sure you know lots of stories here and elsewhere about how that's being done. I'm wondering if you looked into that in your book and whether or not there are any prospects. I kind of get the feeling that this is going to keep going on until we find the right lawsuit, which could take years. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about it and if there are any prospects for stopping it, especially at a government institution like this one.
No, I mean, I think that's the thing that's most astonishing. I mean, if there is any organization that ought to be standing resolutely for free speech for all and not making those categories, it is the government. And if there's any place that they should be doing it, it is campuses, where it's so important that we have free speech, where people are debating these ideas. Campuses have always been our places of debate and higher learning and where we get our best ideas. And the notion that this is happening is terrifying to me, especially because you don't get to pick and choose. Some people's speech is not more valued over anyone else's speech. It's just a crazy notion. It's nowhere delineated in the Constitution. And, what I wish would happen, and federal government has a very powerful stick. State governments have a very powerful stick too, to the extent that they give money to schools as well. But I would love to see someone say that, as a basis of getting your federal money, you can't have speech codes on campus. That would be one way of dealing with. We certainly threaten to withhold money from universities for other reasons, Title IX, for instance, and other things if they don't kind of comply with things. I would love to say you don't get your money if you don't comply with the Constitution. if you don't have a safe space for the First Amendment? So it will probably end up coming to litigation, like you said, because that's unfortunately more frequently how things happen in our country. But it would be nice to see a president who just stood up and said, this is going to be a policy. Yes?
Yeah, maybe just push back or ask two devil's advocate questions. One is on types of speech. So the premise of your argument is that all speech, there's a kind of moral equivalence to all speech.
Yes.
An argument for those from those who'd like to ban certain types of speech is that there isn't a moral equivalence of some type of speech. That some type of speech is genuinely and recognizably objective, right? Or objectionable. Or, in the case of maybe the Exxon case, the Attorney Generals would say, well, they're actually telling lies, right? These aren't.
You get to tell lies under the Constitution.
Right. But
you get to say objectionable things under the Constitution.
Yeah. So maybe just why is that okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is about dark money. I think one of the things, whether you're left or right or unaligned, the hacking scandals have been, and everyone seems to trace this straight to Russia, and they're aimed at one side, right? They're aimed at DNC, and they're aimed at Hillary Clinton's campaign. Well, that's hacking, but why couldn't foreign money be sort of diverted into the American political process? What sort of protections would you think would need to be on those things? So dark money and lies as why should lies be protected speech?
Because they are. I mean, who gets to make that decision in the end? That's the problem, and that's why the founders didn't place restrictions on this. They didn't say, well, you can only say nice stuff. Because who defines what's nice? Okay, what's nice for me is not nice for you. Or nice for you or any single person in this room. What's objectionable to me is not objectionable to half the people in this room. Actually, not much is objectionable to me, so I'm an odd character but that way. But you can't have an arbiter on this. And who would be the arbiter? And do you actually trust them? I mean, this is why we don't have a philosopher king, right? We have a democracy with certain guarantees of certain civil liberties in this country, and it's a document that guarantees those liberties. And it doesn't make a judgment about whether or not you're nice or objectionable. And we have some very, very limited restrictions on free speech. Very limited. You don't call fire in a theater, okay? You don't cause a public panic, for instance. But those are incredibly limited. And in the speech realm, or the political speech realm, by the way, they're almost non-existent. There is really almost no restriction whatsoever on political speech because it is so highly valued. So that's the question in the end. Is that why we don't have? That's why we don't have different categories of speech, because who gets to decide? And so all speech is allowed. Even stuff that makes us uncomfortable and it's difficult and, be tough. Or explain. It forces you to actually have to debate your own side. The founders actually said that the way they wanted our democracy to work is to set, and these are the words, faction against faction. They wanted there to be debate, and at times ugly debate in this country so that we could move ahead to a better place. The dark money thing, we obviously have very tough restrictions on any foreign money on politics here. And our current campaign finance laws do guard against that in a certain amount of way. We've obviously had exceptions to this where people make up fake names and they give money. And, the Justice Department, it's always going to be a cat and mouse game. I think it would be difficult given our current system for anyone to wash significant amounts of money through a system. But it's something that you do have to be guarded on. I don't disagree with you. I think that there is a foreign power behind some of these hacks. It's just too one-sided to say that it's not. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah. Kim, you are the only one I've ever met who moderated a presidential debate. Rumors are we're going to have another one in a few days. She moderated one of the Republican primary debates for CBS this last spring. And in this debate coming up next Monday, there are two candidates who are debating, yet 15 to 20% of the voters in the United States have indicated they prefer neither one of those candidates or no one to be president. It's not perhaps a free speech violation per se, but it might be violating the spirit of the First Amendment to exclude candidates that some people think are relatively important. Where do you draw the line in things like that? Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, for example.
Look, we have rules. I'm a law and order sort of person. The rule is you have to have 15% in some of these most recent polls, and they haven't hit it. So I don't blame the sort of debate moderators for sticking to the rules. That being said, I think that there would be great value in having Gary Johnson and Jill Stein up there on the stage. There are a lot of views to be expressed. I think it's an interesting election too. In the past, what you've seen is one side or the other doesn't want the third party candidate up on the stage because they're worried that they're going to lose their voters to it. It's such a weird election year that neither Donald Trump nor Hillary Clinton wants those other candidates up on stage because they tend to be drawing fairly equally from both sides. And in that regard, I think it'd be great. Throw them all up there. I think it's pretty clear that we're going to have a president of the United States that is not going to win a majority of the popular vote. They're going to win on a plurality. And so might as well just let everybody have their voice. That would be my view on the faith. You had a question.
Yeah, how do you reconcile what you've described with the power of money in Citizens United, for example, and other things that have happened that seem to allow monopolistic or oligopolistic entities to have what I think most people, and the polls back this up, view as an inordinate amount of influence and power in our political process.
Like, who would that be? I'm just curious. Well, so tell me who you think that would be. Like who's? Well, but that's just that I don't really see that. So do you, what I'm curious about.
Just for the sake of this answering question, you're a smart person that graduated from Princeton, or went to Princeton, like my daughter. You can certainly take the position and make some assumption and answer that question.
Okay, well, I don't actually see certain entities having an inordinate...
You don't see any monopolistic or oligopolistic tendencies?
I see lobbyists who have a lot of influence in Washington, but that doesn't have anything to do with elections.
I mean, you know the definition of monopoly and oligopoly, correct?
Yeah, of course. So here's a question. Do you think a union's a monopoly?
No, I'm asking the question. You're doing the talking.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So I guess that would be the answer I would have, though. Like, one person's monopoly or oligopoly is another person's representative organization that allows them to pool their voice into a bigger discussion. So,
all I'm asking is for the sake of being able to respond to the question. If you make an assumption that there may be, maybe means maybe, doesn't mean that absolutely there is or that it exists. Maybe monopolistic or oligopolistic tendencies, if not actual entities that have such power or influence. How do you reconcile that with one person, one vote? I mean, do you really believe that that corporations are the persons as originally conceived under the Constitution? Back then, the only persons who voted were persons who had property. So is your political conscience and your ability to give consent, is that?
So I think corporations fall into the same category as a representative political organization as a union, or as, for instance, the NRA, or for instance, Planned Parenthood. So, you give your money, one person, one vote, I agree with that, but what we've all decided in this country many years ago was that people decided they were going to band together and their voices jointly were going to have more influence than one person singly. So we do that in civic organizations, we do it in unions, we do it in trade associations, we do it in nonprofit associations, and we do it in corporations as well. I've never been entirely sure why corporations get singled out and put in some sort of bad category when it's perfectly okay for 100,000 union members to all have their money taken from them, by the way, not always voluntarily, and used for political purposes.
But it's by all measures, all reasonable measures. The unions in their descent to where they've gone in recent decades are not even close to having the kind of power, economic and political.
There was no greater
that corporate
political
entities
spender.
and those who primarily benefit. Again, I'm asking the question.
No, well, no. The answer to your question is in the 2014 midterm elections, there was no greater category of spender in the election than unions. None. They outpaced corporations significantly. So, one person, one vote?
It probably doesn't do a lot of good when those interests utilizing dark money have managed to stack through gerrymandering most of the states in the country, where most of the congressional offices are no longer even in play. And you know that real well. Are you as critical of that sort of?
Oh yeah, I hate I hate gerrymandering myself. We totally agree on that. Yeah, totally agree. It's a horrible thing. But I guess what I'm saying is we have various different ways of representing ourselves in this country. Sometimes it is one person, one vote. Sometimes we decide that we're going to band together in organizations and like-minded things. And that's protected by the concept of freedom of assembly, because the founders also understood too that people like-minded interests could come together and that their voice then could be heard better. And so we appreciate this, value it, and actually sort of encourage it in our society through all kinds of different, whether it's like your local knitting league or, you know, the bowling league or whatever it is, motorcycle mamas, like whatever. We should like that. What I push back against is the idea that there are some categories of such organizations that don't have the same constitutional protections as others. So, yes, ma'am.
I don't know anything about money or anything like that, but I have a question about the First Amendment. When does free speech become hate speech? And when can an officer justify the use of excessive force because they felt threatened?
So sometimes free speech is hate speech, and there's just nothing we can do about it, because under the First Amendment, you have the right to hate. Doesn't mean it's right, and we as a country can try to dissuade, talk to people, debate back, tell them why it's wrong, make them understand why we shouldn't hate, but it is absolutely constitutionally protected to hate. No one can make you love. It just is, it's not possible. So, it can be hurtful and awful, and, I've had lots of people say really awful things to me too. But it is part of the First Amendment. We allow really awful things to be said under the First Amendment. In terms of excessive force, it's not really my expertise here. Obviously, it's a very difficult subject. We've got police officers who are trying to protect communities, and we've also got cases of excessive force. Every one of those has to be valued individually and merits in each of the cases in which it happens. I can't really sort of blankly make a judgment on all of them as a whole. But anybody else? Yes, sir.
Is obscenity protected in your views under the First Amendment? What's your thoughts on that?
I know it if I see it. Wow, that joke just went over all the young people's heads. The Supreme Court has said that some of it is, a lot of it is. There's sort of a judgment call on that too. Most of the focus of what I've been talking about tonight, and there are different categories of speech. And some of them are less protected than others, and some of them we decide for societal reasons that we have greater protections on than others. Some for safety reasons, some for general public sensibility and sort of standards. But political speech, which is was the main focus of what the founders talked about in the First Amendment, we don't really have a lot of restrictions on that. Certainly, if you listen to any politicians, there's certainly no restrictions on their use of obscenity in politics. Yes?
The freedom of religion and the freedom of speech provisions of the Constitution sometimes conflict. The reason I'm asking this, we're sitting in a chapel in a publicly owned university, which in itself is somewhat unusual. There's the Wren Chapel at William and Mary and a few others. If any religion, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, got up here and started giving sermons every Sunday morning in here. My guess is it would be closed down at some stage because of church and state concerns. Are there issues where those freedom of speech provisions kind of conflict with other provisions of the Constitution?
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion too about where they intersect as well. I mean, the example I gave you earlier about what happened to the people supporting Prop 8 out in California. You know, that is and by the way, for the record, like, I think that was utterly wrong, and I'm actually someone that's in favor of gay marriage myself. So, you know, but you don't do that to people. And that, in a way, because many people are motivated in that view by their religious belief, to the extent that they were expressing their First Amendment right, they were also being harassed for practicing a religious belief as well, too. So the conflicts are less common, although they do happen at times, the 10 amendments outside the courthouse or, you know, whatever it is. But increasingly, we're seeing a confluence of attacks on First Amendment rights are often attacks as a sort of proxy for attacks on religious beliefs as well, too. Yes?
I'm going to totally shift gears.
Yeah?
I want to ask a question sort of about your career.
Oh, sure.
Tell me a little bit. You're a columnist, you know, and I think it's amazing. You know, as an academic, we sort of churn out one article a year or something like that. To have to do these columns, you know, on, you know. When did you start to think that this was something you might do? Or can you take me when you were in college? Did you think, I want to be a writer? I mean, how did that happen?
So I always enjoyed writing. When I was in college, I went to Princeton, as a gentleman noted, and I did a lot of writing for political magazines and organizations on campus. I had a kind of political view even when I was younger, but it was something I just did as a side thing. I did love English. I loved literature. I was a public policy major. I loved politics as well. And I was one of those kids, and I'm sure like some of the young adults in the audience here, who really wasn't sure what they wanted to do exactly when they got done with school. And the only thing I did know was that I was pretty good at school, so I thought I'd be good at going to more school. So I applied to law school. And I was very, very fortunate that I had an after-school job for a couple who lived in town, and I watched their kids. And it turns out that he was the publisher of the Wall Street Journal. And his wife was vice president at Dow Jones, who runs the Wall Street Journal. They were like the kind of power couple of the news industry. And I went to graduate, and they said, don't go to law school right away. Take a year out, go and see the world, do a job, any job, just do something, and get a sense of what it is you want out of the world. And they helped me to get like the lowest of the low. I was like an intern at the Wall Street Journal in Brussels, overseas. So I got to see overseas and and I was only there for about 6 months, and I said, like, I love this. I get to see the world, get to write about politics, get to write about stuff. It was sort of a combination of everything. Started out as a reporter for about 5 or 6 years, and then when I moved back to the United States, I asked to move to the editorial page. And they were so surprised at the editorial page because, you know, the editorial page and the news side of the Wall Street Journal have nothing to do with each other. And the news side really thinks that we are the dark side. And so when I came to ask for a job, they're like, did you come to the right department? I think they were so shocked they just gave it to me because I don't think this had ever happened in the history of the Wall Street Journal that a news side reporter had asked for a job in the editorial page. And so that's kind of the story. But I was always interested in politics even from a very young age. I grew up out in Oregon on a mountain in a logging community. I saw a lot of, and again, this is a personal thing for me, a lot of environmental restrictions that were placed on the area where I live, and I saw a lot of people lose their jobs, a lot of divorce, a lot of rural upheaval for rules that were placed on areas by bureaucrats back in Washington that didn't always understand everything as well as the local community, and that bothered me a lot, and so that was kind of what pushed me into politics as well, too. We will. I was having dinner beforehand, frantically trying to do the last little edits on it before we came over here tonight. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned earlier when you were saying there's some speech that I think are more protected than others, and for example, you said
Yes.
But then there are other types of speech for issues around sensibility, and that could be a little bit more, right?
Yes, you're saying correctly. Yes.
If we're using the sensibility piece as a framework, I'm trying to understand some of what's going on campus. I work in the Multicultural Center, and naturally, when these things happen, students come and we have to have these conversations because, of course, they're obviously emotional about it. And so on the graffiti wall, there's a black stick figure with a noose.
Mm-hmm.
And the initial wording was included. Where, in terms of sort of sensibility. So I'm trying to help the students understand that there's the build a wall piece, which is protected speech because that's a part of the political platform. But the cool piece is where I'm struggling a little bit.
Yeah, so I probably shouldn't have used that word. Like, the question here, he said obscenity. The sort of court case in question was pornography. And the court sort of had and this has evolved over time, and obviously pornography is sort of allowed in sort of every form or fashion, but when some of the first cases came out, there was question about whether or not there was sort of I'm not even sure what the right word is, like a national interest in not allowing pornography. In the end, that sort of went away, by the way. And the first thing I should say is what's up on that wall is horrible, like terrible. Shouldn't be up there. It's wrong. But it's allowed under the First Amendment. And we take those people. Look, I have to say this to my daughter at school. She comes home and she complains about people who are mean to her, or say things to her that are hurtful. And I say, we don't talk to those people. We ostracize those people. We don't deal with those people. Those people need to be put in the corner. And I'm not trying to make light of this. I mean, that is a horrible slur. That's a horrible thing. But it is allowed under the Constitution. Just is. And so we have to think of other ways to get people to rethink. And by the way, also be aware, you will never get some people to ever not be hateful. That's a world in which we will never live, but we can work hard to try to get most people to not be hateful. Yes?
There's a question over here.
Oh, sorry, I missed you.
So you've been critical in the past of Trump's comments about Muslim and saying we need to have coalition with Muslims in order to effectively fight ISIS in the Middle East. I know your talk is mostly focused on sort of like the campus aspect of free speech, but in the political realm, how do you see sort of this sort of I mean, you argue that like both candidates are against free speech, like Hillary Clinton was like a favor of like a law. I think she voted for a bill that's like criminalizing flag burning or something, but on the other hand, you have like Trump openly saying like he wants to have specific targets of like of the freedom of the press. So like you like the Washington Post had like huge constantly opening up these like libel laws. So I mean, you seem to your critique was focused on the left, but you sort of mentioned that there was that both sides have used this tool of censorship, but is there sort of in seeing these like fascist governments getting power all over the world in the West, is that a concern about who really is threatening free speech?
Absolutely. In my defense, by the way, the book came out before Donald Trump was the nominee. But yeah, it's very worrisome to me. I mean, one thing I have learned from Washington is once a genie is out of the bottle, it's very hard to stick it back in. And I will be honest with you, I express great concern about either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump becoming presidency in terms of constitutional protections and free speech in particular. I do not have to work very hard to envision either of them potentially misusing government in some way, form, or another to go after their political enemies in some way. Yes, sorry.
I would never vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton for those specific reasons. I think all free speech absolutely is as well. But I was wondering if there is differences of degree that can be articulated in that sense to push back. Because, like for instance, like Donald Trump has met and has praised with leaders such as like Al-Sisi in Egypt and Putin in Russia who have killed their political dissidents, and he thinks that's strong. And then that's led to people to say, well, okay, there's like even though I don't agree with Hillary Clinton, she does represent the on the surface, even if he doesn't actually like says that it's a good thing. Whereas you have this one candidate who is actually saying like, well, if you have to kill some people or whatever in the street and you have to show free speech, that's a strong leader. And that's like people, and there's this trend where even American conservatives now are in favor of you being Vladimir Putin because he's a strong leader. So is that?
Well, so by the way, like, the weight that I would use is that, like, I mean, I don't know if you can say one is better than the other, but what I would say is that actions matter as much as words. So of course I condemn, like, Donald Trump should not be saying that Vladimir Putin is awesome, because he's not awesome and he does bad things to the people in his country and has authoritarian tendencies. I would also say a failure of leadership in Syria and Iraq has also led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and people who will no longer ever speak again because we had very bad policies with regard to that. So one or the other, like, sort of pick your poison. I'm not sure I would choose one or the other that way. Yes?
One of the main things I understood was the libel law, and also politicians are going after people who essentially really blatantly lie, essentially just rephrasing their words completely, like puzzling. And what's your opinion on that? It's just completely blatant lies that essentially it's not kind of true and actually.
Yeah, so political figures, this is all very complicated. We have fairly loose libel laws in this country, which is probably for the best, okay? In England, there are lawsuits like every other day of the week with someone using a libel law to sue someone else, newspapers and all this sort of stuff, and it's kind of a constant headache over there. The flip side of that is that people in the press and also politicians get very loosey-goosey about what they feel that they can say, to the point where they say things that are just outright lies. And they kind of they get 4 Pinocchios by the fact checkers, but they never really get sued. We also have a thing, by the way, an interesting point. Politicians, if they are down on the Senate floor or the House floor, we actually have a provision in the Constitution that prevents them from being sued for whatever they say. And it is notable, Harry Reid likes to say all kinds of terrible things about the Koch brothers, that they are un-American, that they're tax cheats, that they're liars and everything. He only ever does it on the Senate floor. He never does it in a press conference off of the Senate floor. And there's a reason for that. Yes?
Another place where sort of free speech protections kind of run into perceptions of limits is sort of anti-bullying stuff, particularly online. No one really wants to be in the corner of a bully. I mean, a lot of bad stuff happens online. But do you see any free speech potential problems with the sort of anti-bullying initiatives or laws?
Yeah, what worries me more when there are laws in the state, like, I can understand why schools, I think they've gone overboard, like elementary schools and high schools to some degree in this, and that we should be teaching our children to embrace a little bit of conflict resolution every once in a while. You know, they're a little too coddled and a little too, you know, sometimes life just sucks. You know? And you gotta, you know, you have to learn to deal with that and the fact that not everybody's nice all the time to you. And, you know, I think that there are cases, obviously, of serial, scary bullying. And I don't mind seeing things in schools with young children sort of dealing with that. It worries me more at the sort of state level, because we ought to have laws that already deal about that with, like, basic harassment or sort of violence against you, or in, you know, we have things that should already take care of it. Bullying is a very amorphous term. It's the same thing as speech. Like, what you might consider bullying, I might just consider like an aggressive person in someone's face. So I think we ought to keep it very clear cut about what the legal definitions are of sort of crimes against other people, and up to that, it's a lot harder to make the case that you should have that kind of stuff. Yes?
I don't know if I'll ever be able to ask someone who's moderated a debate before this question, so I'm going to have to ask.
Yeah.
What do you think the role of moderator is as far as the freedom of speech, obviously, but then fact-checking and balancing that? What is your opinion?
Yeah, so I have a very defined view on this. You know, Matt Lauer took all this criticism for doing that forum and not fact-checking, you know, Trump and different people on the fly. I think, first of all, I thought Matt Lauer did a pretty good job. He was very critical to both sides, and you know, it was the best you could do. And in that environment too, like maybe he could have done a little bit more fact checking. It was just him, and because the candidates went one right after the other too, which I think was the sort of important thing. This was not a debate. It was a forum. And so it was only Matt Lauer and the person. And so there was no opposing person to check up with someone who said wrong. But what that gets to the answer to your question, I think debates, I think the moderator's role is to ask a substantive question, not a leading question, not an innuendo. How do you feel about, you know, but you know, what's your position on the Fifth Fleet? How many Marines should we have here? Whatever it is. They say something that's not true, then it's up to the other person, their debating opponent, to check them up on it, because it's a debate. And one of the things that just drives me nuts about this country, I lived in England for 6 years, they have real debates. Anybody in this room who has never sat down and just watched Question Time, when, you know, the Prime Minister has to go and face his Parliament, and everyone gets to shout questions to him, and he just has to answer them one after another, and no one's saying 90 seconds, the buzzer rang. You know, they just go back and forth, and it's a skill they learn over there, and their electorate learns a lot from it because they're forced to do it, and I wish we had that tradition in this country. Yeah. Is there anything else? Wow. Yeah.
Just a quick shift. What's your opinion on the biased media today and how it affects a lot of internal voters? I see a lot of stuff on my phone that shows up on their standard iPhones now. It's just straight up like opinion articles from like Huffington Post. And it's just, it's bad.
So, you know, I've worked in the media for 22 years. And I was at the Wall Street Journal. I'm like one of those lame people that never had another job. And I worked on the news side of the newspaper for a long time, by the way. So it kind of gave me a perspective of the opinion side versus the news side. And I will say, my colleagues are like rock solid good journalists. In all of my time of working in the newspaper world, I've probably only come across 4 or 5 straight news journalists who I felt really had an agenda. Like the kind of people who got up in the morning and they're like, I'm going to take it to Republicans, or I'm going to write an article that sort of is all about sort of misrepresenting the facts and getting my viewpoint. You don't find them very often. I think what you do find is much more subtle and worrisome. We talk a lot about diversity on campus, for instance. We do not have enough diversity in journalism. Almost everybody who goes into journalism grew up in the kind of same sort of suburb and went to the sort of same liberal arts college and sort of had the same professors and the same sort of viewpoint, and as a result they look at the world in a certain way. And yes, that's probably like a little bit of a left to center thing, which I'm not even going to be critical about, because certain types of people are drawn to journalism. They want to sort of save the world and sort of do, you know, expose things, and there's certain sort of people that look at that, and it's go into journalism for that reason. But we need to try and get other voices. I remember I once went to a media bias forum where I was asked to sit there, and the guy, what's his name? Ben Bradley from the Washington Post was there, and he's sort of sitting there. He's like amazing, you know, journalism hero, and he's there, and the moderator asked me about this, and I said something about this, and I pointed out that, you know, it always bothered me, for instance, like having grown up where I did in a very rural part of the nation where I saw a lot of damage come from environmental rules, that, you know, every single headline in the New York Times and the Washington Post always just by the headline like presented any environmental rule as this like great step forward in progress, and anytime they were got rid of as some sort of terrible thing that had happened to the environment. And I was like, how's that fair? Like, those stories never tell the story of the people who lost their jobs and whether or not these rules are in fact effective or anything. And, you know, it's just bias. These are people who all grew up writing these headlines who all just think any environmental rule must by definition be a good thing. So he put this question to, I think it was Bradley, maybe it was someone else. Anyway, put a question to him. He goes, well, what do you think about that? Do you think that's a problem? And I remember he goes, but all environmental rules are good. And I was like, okay, well, that sort of proved my point right there. So, you know, we need more people from different walks of life that are in journalism. The other thing we need, and I would just point this out for younger people in the audience too, I was floored. I taught a kind of guest editorial writing course out at Hillsdale College. Amazing students, they were great. came to all the classes, they didn't even wear pajama bottoms. I was like so amazed by them. And they came in, but the first class I asked them, like, how do you get your news? Raise your hand if you get a newspaper delivered to you. And of course, no one in the room raised their hand. And it came out, of course, they read it all on their phone and their iPad. Totally understandable. I read my news on my iPad too. But then I said, well, do you actually subscribe to a newspaper? Do you go and read a newspaper from beginning to end to see what the news is for the day from that newspaper? And no one raised their hand. And I said, well, then how do you get your news? Like, how do you decide what you're going to read? They only read news that was tweeted or Facebooked or Snapchatted to them. And this gets to the bias point because we are turning into a society that self-selects its news, that only goes to cable channels that we like watching, that only reads newspapers or websites that we enjoy reading, that affirm everything we believe already and never challenge us on anything on the other side, and I think that that's a problem. The upside is that we have many more sources of news these days, so for those who are interested in reading the other side, there's more opportunities to do that, more chances to get things out to us and sort of blow the whistle on corruption and bad stuff. That's all good, but we actually have to make an effort to find it. Yes, sir.
Since you've been honest enough to sort of confide, talk about your where you grew up and your background and your obvious disdain for bureaucrats, the federal government, and for the East Coast media. I'm just curious, are you in favor of clear cutting all the forests, literally and figuratively? Is there any limitation or balance to your view about the concentration of wealth and power, economic and political?
Yeah, so first of all, I don't disdain the federal government, bureaucrats. I don't disdain all bureaucrats either. Some of them are really sort of good, top-notch civil servants who have devoted their lives to important things. I think
especially somebody like Chris Stevens from the point of view of the right.
Well, I think there are other people in other categories too, beyond sort of ambassadors. But so let me give you an example. I grew up out in Oregon, and it's a really interesting dichotomy out there. There are federal forest lands and state forest lands. And one of the things that's really interesting is, even though Oregon's a very progressive state, our public schools are funded by our timber on our state lands. And the state of Oregon does the most magnificent job ever maintaining those forests, because on the basis of those forests comes all the revenue to educate all the kids. So yeah, they clear cut a lot, but they also keep a lot of places that it's a constant source of management. There's no spaces where there's no trees on state lands. They're not about to destroy their renewable resource that's going to fund their schools 100 years from now. They manage that resource intelligently and well. And that is all anyone's ever asked from federal forest management is too. I think what is the problem is instead when a bureaucrat in Washington says, we're not going to have any more cutting in any more national forests because we heard about this thing called spotted owl. And we really don't have a lot of science on it, and it turns out 20 years later we found out that the real problem with spotted owl is not old growth forest, but a predator owl from California that eats them all. But now there's thousands of loggers out of work, but hey, sorry about that.
Except that the spotted owl is a part of an ecosystem, not...
Well, yeah, ecosystem on state lands too. But anyway, the point being is that, I don't hate all bureaucrats, but I do hate sort of bad decisions that aren't always made on science, and that in general, like, we have renewable resources and we have proven that we can manage them and use them well, and that we can also grow economies and jobs. There's no reason why we can't do all of those things at the same time. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things I've noticed is that, and I think it's really dangerous, and I'd like you to comment on it, is that in probably the last 10 years, there's been a tendency on campuses to listen to a student who says, I'm offended, or my feelings are hurt. And the bureaucrats or the administrators to whom they are complaining, the response is, oh, well, that's really too bad. And I feel sorry for you, and let's find out who made you feel bad. Mm-hmm. Or let's find out who offended you. Mm-hmm. And so then the free speech attacks go against the people that are just voicing an opinion And the people who are getting offended are trying to take free speech away from those that they claim are attacking them. Is this widespread? Do you see this happening?
Well, it happens everywhere. But again, I mean, we have to decide as educators, as parents, as everyone. Look, my fourth grader came home the other day. She's got a new kid in her class, and the little kid was really mean to her, called her all kinds of nasty names. And I looked at her and I said, well, why are you telling me this? She goes, I just wanted you to know, because it kind of made me sad today. I was like, I wasn't going to do anything, but I was like, do you want me to do something? She's like, no, because, you know, that's not going to stop her from doing it. It's not going to stop her. I mean, I wouldn't have intervened anyway, because you know what? Her whole life, there are going to be people who hurt her feelings. She's going to have to learn to deal with it. You know, and so we can either treat each of these things as some sort of cosmic event and say, like, poor thing, and let me find out and intervene and make myself, like, mom will come to the rescue and deal with it, or you can learn that those people are not who you sit by at lunch.
And they have the right to say what they want to say.
Yes, yeah. You know. So, anyway, thank you all. Thank you.